Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Dr. Barbara Lane. So would you ask Dr. Lane to come in, please? Good morning, Dr. Lane.
Good morning.
All ready to carry on?
Well, I just want to talk about the screen and things because yesterday my A3 pages are very blurry and they're too small in here. And I'd appreciate if you could give me the section number when the thing is coming up on the screen so I can read it and listen to you and answer the question.
Okay.
Because it's very fast and I'm trying to read and then listen a little bit late. So if you could say the section number, I will read it when it's small and large.
I see.
I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah. I don't think we're going back to too many of those big A3 sections today, but they were a bit challenging.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
All right,
no
we'll
worries.
try and make sure you can...
No, it's just because I want to answer the questions properly.
No, of course you must, yes.
Yeah.
Right, Ms. Gray.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, can I just pick up on one part of your evidence yesterday? And if we could just go back to the transcript. So this is day 61, page 65, and I want to look at lines 5 to 9. So this is where we were discussing, if you remember, the kind of evolution in thinking between like 2012, 2013, 2014, if you remember.
Yes.
In your evidence yesterday. And then if we pick up at line 5, you say, by 2013, I did go back, I dug out all my old notebooks the other day to see what was up to. By 2013, we were sufficiently worried about materials and certificates that we started to run joint fire and facade seminars together within Arup.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I just wanted to be absolutely clear. So those were internal seminars between Arup Fire and Arup Facades, is that right?
That's what I was referring to yesterday.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Were any external outside organisations or individuals involved in, say, those seminars?
In those private seminars in Arup, no. But if you're trying to ask me about external events in 2013, yes, there were some external events where different companies or individuals were raising concerns. I could not list out all the dates.
No, I understand. But that's
for the companies, because I haven't prepared for that.
No, I understand. But just to get the general sense that it wasn't just within Arup that this was being
absolutely not.
realised.
I mean, I was trying to not stray too far.
Yes.
But I'm very clear that in 2013, let's say external to my company, there were other professional organisations like Arup and other types of organisations raising questions.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you. Now, we've got to look at issue 3 of Exover's work from November 2013 yesterday.
Yes.
I'm now going to go forward in time and look at what happened with Exover's involvement after issue 3.
Okay.
And into the time when Ryden is appointed as design and build contractor.
Yes.
So that's going to be a big theme of the questions coming up. Now, it's right, isn't it, that the whole process of selecting the ACM and selecting the particular ACM panels was one that was done without involving or consulting Exover?
Yes, and I've made no such assertion in my report, and I also wouldn't expect a fire safety engineer at that time to ever be consulted on selection of products.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned yesterday that you are also familiar with the NBS specification from...
Yes, I have studied it for the inquiry.
Yeah, from January 2014.
All versions, yes.
Yes, actually, you're right. There were a number of drafts and then iterations in late 2013 and then the final version in January 14.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, are you aware that Studio E sought no input from Exover on the NBS specification, including the different alternative materials within that?
I'm very well aware and I have no concern with that arrangement.
Yeah. Now, the contract was then put out to tender. Ryden, after the OJEU procurement exercise, are chosen. And then on the 1st of April 2014, there's an initial meeting with the contractor And on that agenda is the possibility of swapping zinc for Rainabond cassettes. And it's right, isn't it, that Exova weren't at or even invited to that meeting, and I think weren't even sent the minutes of it.
As would be entirely normal practice.
Yeah.
At that time.
And I just want to highlight something you say at at page 284 of your report, if we could bring that up now. So that's BLARP 25017. And look at paragraph 9.1.34. And you say there, it's very important to acknowledge the change from zinc to ACM, and it is correct that Exova were not asked their opinion about this change as I read the evidence available.
Yes.
And that remains your position? Yes,
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Just so we're absolutely clear about the change from zinc to ACM.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And you also, in your report, you've listed some instances where it's apparent that Ryden contacted RBKC Building Control directly to discuss matters relating to fire safety, and that Exova were excluded from some of those discussions.
That's correct.
And yet, and this is a point you made yesterday, and I want to take you to the invoice table. You've made the point that Exova do continue to invoice the TMO.
Yes.
And that the latest invoice we found is, I think, February 2015. Can we look at that in your report? If we go to page 89 of your report. Here, I think, is that invoice table that you were referring to yesterday. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So what you've helpfully done here is split down all the invoice numbers and their dates on the left-hand side, the amounts, and the name of the person and organisation they were issued to.
Yes.
I think always either Apple Yards or the TMO. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or both sometimes.
Yeah. So I've given the names there. Yes.
Yeah. And if we could go down the page, we can see that there's invoices then in March 2014 at the bottom of that page, October 2014, February 2015, and then if we go over the page, time booked after 18th of February 15, but no associated invoice provided to you. So that's the invoicing position, is that correct?
In the evidence that I have available to
Yes,
you.
in the written evidence.
Yes.
Yeah. And you acknowledge in your report that Exova claims that it was, quote, substantially excluded from the project following the third issue of its report and the appointment of a design and build contractor. Now, can we just be clear about your view? And I just want to summarise your view and check that you agree with this. Do you agree that it is your opinion, as expressed in your written report, that by that stage there had already been very serious failures in Exova's work, both on the existing fire strategy and the fire strategy for the refurbishment works?
Yes, I do.
And am I right in summary that your evidence is that even after that stage, Exova did respond to queries, but did so inadequately?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and I'm going to take you back to a couple of those, including the important ones in the 18th of September 2014 and then in March 2015.
Yeah.
We'll do that in a moment. So we can see from the email exchanges that Exova were consulted on an ad hoc basis to give advice on issues that arose after Ryden's appointment as contractor. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, and that, again, that's something that's very familiar to me in entirely normal practice.
And we see a number of emails in which Exova are consulted about the works, and you've helpfully set out some of those exchanges in a table at section 8.4 of your report, and I want to just look at that now briefly. If we go to page 256. It's a table 8.1. If we could blow up the bottom of that page, it begins at the bottom of that page. Are you able to see that easily on the screen?
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's the landscape page.
It's the A3 that are a problem.
Yeah.
So here we've got table 8.1, and you've got evidence of fire safety design advice being provided by Exova by email and or telephone contact.
Yeah.
And then you've set out a chronology of some of the advice. And if we could look at the next page.
Yeah. we need to keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. In 2012. And then perhaps we can go to the next page.
Yeah. Yeah, just if we keep going to, I think you said about after Ryden have been appointed.
Yeah. So
So
if we
March.
keep going
Yeah.
across this table. If we go to the next page.
Yeah, if we can we keep going?
Yeah.
Just to 2014.
Yes. So keep going. Sorry, I haven't got the exact page reference for when it starts at page 2014, but it's coming up, I think, shortly.
Yeah.
Yes, so
Okay,
here
yeah.
then we can see
Yeah.
after their third issue, we
Yeah.
get the 18th of September 2014. There's a couple of exchanges there
Yeah.
we will look at. And then if we go over the next page, 29th of September 14, 23rd of October 14,
Yeah.
we can keep going. And then we have some in 2015
Yes.
there.
Yeah.
And it goes all the way to December 2016. That's
Yes.
right, isn't it?
And again, I just want to be clear that that's, again, aligned with my own experience working on projects. You've issued your detailed fire safety strategy for which you're responsible.
Yeah.
And then depending on how the project's going, depending on the rest of your scope of work, you'll have queries like that for the rest of the project, or you may be appointed to do something more detailed.
Yes.
But the most important point is that your detailed fire safety strategy is finished and available as a reference document to the rest of the professional design team as they carry on with their duties for the rest of the project.
Yes. Now, can I look at something you say at page 270 of your report, paragraph 8.4.11?
Yeah.
This is where you've set out the table clearly.
Yeah.
And then you're making a number of remarks, and I want
Yeah.
to pick up there. And you say, in reviewing the queries Exova received, I consider these to be directly caused
Yeah.
by the fact no detailed fire strategy had ever
Yeah.
been produced.
Yeah.
The queries are basic questions about performance requirements in fire.
Yes.
So do I take it that you have looked at those email exchanges that have occurred through to
Yes, I have.
2016, some in 2014, some in
Yes.
2015, some in 2016?
Yes.
And your view is that had a detailed fire strategy been prepared,
Yeah.
what, all of those wouldn't have been necessary, or just a large proportion of them?
I'm not going to say all because I can't frantically go and read everything again, but a
Yeah.
large proportion of them.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly interested in all the questions over many years. It wasn't just a period of weeks, for 2 further years, asking basic questions about cavity barriers and insulation.
Yeah.
Neither of which was addressed in the detailed fire safety strategy, as it should have been.
Yeah. Do you think that those were points that might have cropped up anyway as the design evolved?
They very well may anyway, and I think, you know, I was thinking about this. I think this concept that the professionals in the construction industry could write a report and leave out bits on some kind of assessment they've made of other people in the design team, I don't understand that as a proposition. And I think even when you write a detailed fire safety strategy, it's perfectly acceptable for people to still come back to the fire safety professional and just recheck, ask another few questions, make sure their understanding is accurate.
Yeah.
Okay? I don't think that's an excuse to not produce a detailed fire safety strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to summarise, and then I'm going to ask you some more questions on this theme, the position appears to be that after Ryden were appointed, Exova wasn't asked at any point, whether by the TMO, Studio E, Ryden or Building Control, they weren't specifically asked to update the third version of their report. But they do get asked a number of questions from time to time,
Yes.
mainly by Studio E.
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you, what would you reasonably expect Exova to do when being asked those additional questions?
So I know I sound like a broken record. They should already have issued their detailed fire strategy as they offered in their own scope of work. And then when hopefully I'll have the opportunity to show some details. But when the design team were clearly reaching for information, and Mr. Ashton, should have known it wasn't in his report, I feel it was time to update that report. And that's what my professional practice is.
But do you think he should have unilaterally done that and just gone ahead and updated his report and sent it? Or do you think he should have sought clarification about what his role was at that point?
So it's a matter for him to explain why the report wasn't finished in the first place. If he had concerns about contractual arrangements, or if Exova were going to get paid, which is entirely valid, if they were to do some work, the bare minimum I would expect a fire safety engineer to do is to simply write to their client and say, I'm getting asked lots of questions about cavity barriers. I haven't addressed it in my report. I need X number of days to carry out this activity. Do I have your approval to proceed? Perfectly normal professional practice.
Yeah.
That is not an unreasonable ask of an experienced company working in the built environment.
Yeah. So do you consider it was important for Exova to be informing their client, the TMO, that there was work that still needed to be done on the fire strategy and that was incomplete?
Oh, that it was incomplete. It shouldn't have been incomplete, but it was incomplete, and the design team were asking for help. So yes, I would expect them to take a proactive step to resolve the matter either way. If the client instructs you, no, don't do any more work, and that does happen sometimes, then you can write and say, I need you to understand that my report has not addressed B4, and there is a risk because that work has not been completed. You need to get someone else to do that assessment.
Yeah.
So I think there's a duty of care to, personally, I think you should get your work done anyway. And if you can't, for whatever reason, you explain to the decision makers the consequences of you not finishing or doing that work. And we are trained to behave and operate that way.
Yeah. So just to be clear, are you critical of Exova for allowing itself to be drawn into advising on an ad hoc basis without being more formal about their contractual position?
No, because they offered an ad hoc basis level of service in their fee proposal.
I see.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is, as you read the fee proposal, the stage F work was always going to be assisting the contractor on an ongoing basis.
That's what Exova said.
Yeah. Now, you note in your report that the TMO never formally stood Exova down. So there's no evidence, is there, that the TMO ever said to Exova, actually, your appointment is terminated now.
Yes.
It's finished.
I have not found any evidence about that.
And neither did Studio E or any other party inform Exova that their services were no longer required.
That's correct. And again, I need to say that commonly occurs.
Do you agree that it would have been difficult for Exova to have interposed themselves between Ryden and the TMO once Ryden come on board as the main design and build contractor?
Would you just explain a little bit more of what you mean by interpose?
That once Ryden come on board, there's a kind of big change in terms of the way the project is structured and the responsibilities on the project. And it might be said that once a design and build contractor is on board, it's obvious that if they don't appoint a fire engineer, Exova's work has run its course. What would you say to that?
Oh, no, I don't agree with that at all. Okay. It's not obvious, and it isn't I don't understand. I mean, when the contractor gets appointed or is being considered, like my experience is there'll be, and you can see that in the evidence here, all sorts of exchanges trying to get, who's getting novated, who isn't, all the arrangements set up, ready for day one. That happens on all the design and build contracts I've ever worked on.
Yeah.
When Exova were first appointed, they were appointed, I think, by the TMO to give such advice through or to Studio E as Studio E might think was required. Is that fair at that stage?
Why? Where does it say in their scope that it's for the architect?
Well, that was the way they reported anyway, and it doesn't seem to. No one seems to have objected to that. But I was really asking the question to compare it with the situation after the appointment of Ryden.
Yeah.
And Ryden take over responsibility for design.
Okay.
At that point, presumably, Exova was still engaged by the TMO to give such advice on design or on fire safety as Ryden might.
Okay,
require.
so that's really interesting. So I don't see that the scope of work is to assist just the architect.
Mm-hmm.
So a client appoints a fire safety engineer, and unless I wrote expressly, dear client, I understand you want me to assist only the architect on the design team, which would be quite rare. We are providing advice to the team, and we are producing our own advice for the benefit of the team, not just for one company.
Right. Yes.
Okay. I entirely understand that when a principal contractor is appointed, whose leading decision making day to day has altered or increased or changed in some way, but when my experience is when I'm stick with the client after that change, which happens a lot. You're still giving advice on behalf of the client. If I was worried because Ryden knew people were contacting me, I would write to my client and say, look, the principal contractor and his or her team are now contacting me. Do you want me to carry on providing advice to those new parties? And my client will say to me either yes or no. Don't give any advice to the principal contractor and their team. I want you to just check everything at the end or something like that. So there is an obligation to check with your client, which was the TMO in this instance, if they wanted you to carry on giving advice to Ryden and any other individuals Ryden had appointed.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's again, please don't think that's a weird experience of mine. That is normal practice in the industry.
Right, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
sorry.
helpful. Now, you note, if we can bring it up on the page, at 339 of your report, page 339, paragraph 14.1.58, there you've said, and this links to the point you've just made, I've found no evidence of any concern expressed by Exova staff at any time relating to any uncertainty they had about the contracted status once Ryden was on board.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is you've looked at all the exchanges that were occurring afterwards.
Yeah.
Some of them were with Studio E, some of them were with Ryden or their appointed subcontractors.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you can't find anywhere any evidence of Exova saying, hang on a moment, who are we being asked to advise? What's our current status? What's our contractual position? That just doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't. I mean, everyone's entitled to worry about being paid, if nothing else. So that's why you check.
Ms. Granger, I thought the thrust of the question which precipitated these exchanges was that it was not perhaps reasonable to expect Exova to, well, you used the word interpose itself, but in a sense take an active stance as between Ryden and the TMO. Was that the point?
That was one of the points that's being made.
Just to make sure we get a...
Yeah.
So active...
So I think one of the points that might be made is it certainly wasn't reasonable to expect Exova to just finish its fire strategy work of its own volition once a design and build contractor comes on board.
So I'm very sorry. They were meant to have finished their fire strategy before Ryden were appointed. And that keeps getting blurred.
Yeah.
They had to have finished their Stage E detailed fire strategy before the contractor came on board. Normal, common practice on design and build projects.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, is that helpful?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that the question, which might be quite an important one, had been answered.
Yeah. Now, just some other points about what happens once Ryden are appointed. It's right, once Ryden are appointed, that Exova aren't passed any work packages to review. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And they're not asked to carry out a compliance check by any of the design team. Is that correct?
A compliance check
Of the overall, the final design.
as the more and more detail was being produced.
Yeah.
No one on the design team asked the fire safety engineer to do a full review.
Yeah. And is it right that Exova, they aren't invited to any design team meetings?
That's correct.
And they aren't invited to any meetings with building control?
That's correct, yes.
Nor to any meetings with the TMO themselves?
No.
Now, does any of that affect the views that you've expressed in the last 15 minutes?
No, it doesn't, because again, that is also my experience when I'm working on projects.
Yeah. Now, the understanding of the Studio E witnesses when they gave oral evidence was simply that Exova was available as and when questions came up.
Yes.
And that's consistent with what you see in the documents, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, Ryden's attitude appears to be that if necessary, Studio E should take advantage of any free advice that Exova were offering.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a shame. Yeah. Again, just terribly typical of things. Yep.
When you say it's terribly typical of things, can you explain?
I don't know all those people, but I don't, factually, I don't know why Ryden called it free advice. I presume they meant it was free to them, but it's best that they discuss what that meant to them. In my mind, the facts are Exova had an appointment, and they were asked to give advice, and if they were worried, they should have checked.
Yeah. And is it right that any further fees that Exova charged or invoiced in that later period were negligible, i.e. less than £300?
Yes, it was a very low amount.
Yeah.
Can I just, I'm sorry, following up this thought that you were putting to Dr. Lane earlier.
Yeah.
I know that you take the view, and I understand why, that the fire strategy report was not completed by Exova. Once Ryden came on board and became responsible for design, might it be said by Exova, well, at that point, we were only expected to do that which we were specifically asked to do?
Yeah.
Or are you suggesting that they should have been aware that there was unfinished work that should have been completed without any further request?
Okay, so I think, presumably Exova considered their fire strategy to be complete. I'm retrospectively saying it wasn't because there were so many things missing from it, okay? So I'm assuming they considered it to be complete, and the design team included it in the employer's requirements because they considered it to be complete. The fire strategy is seen as being a risk item to a principal contractor normally. They like to know it's complete and it's been approved or approved in principle by building control before they take on that risk, okay? That's another thing that happens, and that's where the timing comes into it all. So you have the strategy completed. You can say to the architect and the looming principal contractor, I've had various discussions with building control, and in general, they're happy with the founding principles of the report. So once you take this and use it for your detailed design, you're not running at risk. Okay?
It might be said that the fire strategy report in relation to B4 was on its face not complete and was not thought to be complete because it referred to a further report. Is that further report something which, in your view, ought to have been provided, as it were, in any event, or was Exover entitled to wait and see if it were asked for a further report and given further information on which to make it?
So I don't understand what the further report was going to be, okay? I don't know what was in their minds. As a minimum, I think they should have set out the basic performance standards as part of their fire strategy. If the contractor was going to come along and wanted to do something very different to what was set in the fire strategy, then I can imagine someone needed to be commissioned to do a further report. To set out the minimum requirements of their fire strategy, you don't need a lot of detail just to be clear on those points.
All right, I mean, I raised the point because I think I'm right in saying that Mr. Ashton said that he had not been told about the nature of the cladding at the time when he produced or Exover produced the fire strategy report.
Yes.
And the impression I have, we'll have to check his evidence, is that he was expecting to be given more information about the cladding.
Yes.
Before he could say anything more definitive about the implications for B4.
Okay, so I think you all use the phrase reasonably competent fire engineer would set out the minimum requirements and leave it at that. Later on, and I think we will get there.
Yeah.
He is asked very specific questions about the exact makeup of Harley's proposals. So if in Exover's plan was they were going to do even more when they had that very specific information, that was the time to now say to everyone, we told you we were going to do even more work on B4. The questions are now coming in, the product-specific information's coming in. We would like to finish B4. Please confirm you are agreed. It is time for us to do that, if they were worried commercially.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Yes. I've got the passage here. I think we should go to it now in Mr. Ashton's evidence, which is helpful about how he saw the fire strategy. If we can go to day 17, page 132. And if we look at lines, if we look at line 8 there and pick it up there, I ask him, you didn't have a look back at the fee proposal and remind yourself what you'd committed to doing on the project. And then he said, no, I wouldn't do that routinely. And then I say, we saw and we looked at it in detail yesterday that a detailed fire strategy for the proposed development was promised in that proposal. He says it was, yes, indeed. And then I say, so this wasn't the detailed fire strategy? No, it certainly, for example, it doesn't contain an analysis under B4. And then I said, no, and that detailed fire strategy was said to be going to include determination of any external fire spread issues. And he says, indeed. And recommendations of compartmentation, yeah. But we don't see that in this report. And then if we go over the page, no, as I say, this wasn't, as far as I was concerned, this wasn't the final report. So that was Mr. Ashton's evidence. Now,
Okay.
Just to be clear, does that affect the answer that you just gave to the chairman about what you would have expected Exover to do once they are being asked specific questions later in the project?
I don't think it does, no, because if the third version of their fire strategy, which occurred in stage E, wasn't a stage E fire strategy, it's not written down anywhere anyway what stage strategy it is, which again is normal to do. Okay, people know this is the stage C, stage D, stage E report. If he hadn't got round to doing his stage E report, and I still don't understand why not, now really specific questions are coming in about now the construction team are in place and we're into named materials. Isn't it the time to say, do you understand my fire strategy is not the detailed fire strategy I offered? And do you want me to now write it, just as a minimum?
Yeah. Now, can I just show you some of XOVA's internal operating procedures for a moment? So if we can go to EXO 401209. This is dated the 18th of December 2014.
Yeah.
And it's called Overall Procedure Review.
Yeah.
And if we look at figure 1 on page 2, it suggests in this flow diagram that after the main project phase, which is the fourth box down, there's going to be a project completion procedure to be followed.
Yes.
And then if we go to page 4, in section 9, there's something called project closure.
Yeah.
And it says XOVA procedure, and then it's got a name of the procedure, describes the project closure process, which requires a check that all elements of the project have been completed satisfactorily, a check that time and costs have been posted via the timesheet, a check that the project's been fully invoiced, all relevant electronic files to be placed in the correct folders, etc. Now, before I ask you some questions about that, I just want to look at another of XOVA's project completion procedures, this time dated the 1st of April 2010.
Yeah.
If we can go to EXO 401224. Now, on page 1, there is a heading under paragraph 4. If we can look at the bottom half of the page, there's a heading there, closure of the projects.
Yeah.
And it says this: for many projects, the exact point at which the consultancy work has been completed is not always immediately evident. The project manager should make a careful note of the scope of services provided in the contract documentation. This would initially be the fee proposal, which was provided, and the details confirmed on the fee acceptance form. And then 2 bullets below, it says to ensure, just below then there's a sentence beginning Appendix A, and then below that there's a sentence that says to ensure that a high standard is maintained, the project manager is required to, and then it says check that all elements of the project to have been completed satisfactorily. This will entail a review of the scope of services set out in the fee proposal and a specific review of the documents stored on the electronic filing system. So, and then it suggests you do that or contact the client or the client's representative to ensure they are satisfied that the scope of services matches their expectations. So that's what we see in their written procedures. Is a project completion procedure of some description standard practice amongst competent fire engineers?
Any fire safety engineering company that operates to the ISO 9001, which again is common practice, yes, it is.
Does XOVA's procedure reflect what you would generally expect of such a procedure, having looked at that limited information I just showed you?
So I just want to be absolutely clear, I've not reviewed XOVA's full management system under the ISO, but in the context of the language on this page, it is a closeout in the sense you're actively taking a step. There's 2 options given to make sure your work is completed, and that aligns with the type of requirements that are set for our staff as well. It's a very important part of the work. And does a project completion procedure usually require a check that the scope of services have been completed and or that the client is satisfied? Absolutely, yes, yep.
And have you seen any evidence that this project completion procedure was followed by XOVA on the Grenfell project?
Not in the evidence available to me.
Now,
Ms. Grange, would it be okay? I would like the panel to see an email exchange between Bruce Soons and Terry Ashton about fees.
Do you know? Can you remember the date of that?
It was in February 2013. Bruce Soons wrote to Terry Ashton to ask him their status on the project. Their fees status on the project.
Yeah, we'll find that right now.
Yeah, and if we just whenever you're ready, because that is relevant to these completion procedures also. And it's in my report.
Yeah. Now, Exover's position in this inquiry is that after the third issue of its report, it was substantially excluded from the project, and TMO effectively put an end to Exover's continuing obligations. Now, having regard to that project completion procedure, what is your view of that contention that its role simply fell away or was put to an end?
Yeah, but the contention isn't fell away or put to an end. It's excluded, which is a very strong word. And then the second point was, is it effectively ended by the TMO, I think you said, in your question?
Effectively put to an end Exover's continuing obligations.
No, I don't understand. I don't understand why that is being said.
Okay. I think the email I've had a reference is EXO 50639.
Yeah. Excluded means, it's quite a dramatic kind of pushing out.
Yeah.
I see people contacting the fire safety engineer when they think they need some fire safety advice.
Yeah.
That's not the classification of exclusion in my mind.
Yeah. Is this the email that you were just referring to?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I thought it's useful when thinking about these completion procedures for the panel to see this email.
So we've got from Terry Ashton to Bruce Soons,
Yeah.
11th of February 2013.
Yeah. Okay, so he says one was for providing a fire safety strategy for the existing building.
Yeah.
And the other is for C, D, E and F.
Yeah.
Work relation to the former has been completed.
Yeah.
With regard to the latter, he sets out that they've invoiced for stage C.
Yeah.
And they're now invoicing in stage D, E.
Yeah. And then he says, we indicated that for RIBA stage F, work would be at the appropriate hourly rate due to the uncertainty about the amount of input that would be needed. Yes.
So one part of the work is already completed, so I don't know if he considered this to be the completion procedure here.
Right.
And it also shows an understanding of moving through the stages.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Now, I want to move now to the 18th of September 2014 and the emails that occurred at that time. You address this at page 285 and following of your report. Yeah. So that we know that by email dated the 18th of September 2014, Neil Crawford of Studio E forwards to Terry Ashton a request for information, RFI number 1, received from Harley relating to horizontal fire breaks within the cladding.
Yes.
We can see that at SEA 3011703.
Yeah. I'd really like to, oh yes, good. And if we could also have the actual RFI, because there's very interesting text in there, please. Is that okay?
I can take you to both.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. So so this is from Daniel Ankerton-Jones to Simon Lawrence, so to Ryden and Studio E.
Yeah.
Attaching Harley's request for information form number 1.
Yes.
Which relates to the requirement of fire breaks.
Yeah.
And he says this may be something that's already been decided or may need confirmation from the local fire officer, as the opinion tends to vary.
Yeah.
And the RFI, we can find that at HAR 403616.
And I think even this email is very interesting because he clearly has some prior experience where opinions have varied. Okay, so I would be paying very close attention now to this correspondence.
Yeah. So this is the RFI. We can see it's from Daniel Ankerton-Jones in the top right-hand corner, dated the 17th of September. The query is, please may you confirm the required extent of the horizontal fire breaks within the cladding areas.
Yeah.
And the suggested solution says, we believe that they will be required at every floor level on the vertical columns, but not in the area of cladding between windows. This is because there's no chimney effect here, and therefore the cladding will not add to the spread of fire. Now, you wanted to go to this.
Yeah, so I think, this is actually such an interesting question. And it shows, Daniel Ankerton-Jones clearly has either had some experience or is thinking about the columns acting as he uses the word, I think it's chimney. And then he's thought even more then about the area between the columns, and he's decided there's no potential for a chimney effect there. So there's a lot of thinking going on about fire, in his view, you know, how the fire might perform.
Yeah.
And that is the background. That quite complex question, actually, is the background to the email exchange we're going to see. So there's a recognition that cladding the columns so extensively may cause this classic chimney effect for the fire spread, and for some reason he thinks the windows are going to break that effect between the columns.
Yeah. Now, Terry Ashton's response is at EXO 50708, and it's the third email down on page 1.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think perhaps if we go to page 2, what we see is he's sent this email exchange.
Yeah. So
if we go in the middle of that page, Neil Crawford, hi Terry, I'm working on the Grenfell Tower regeneration project from the Studio E end. The following RFI has come in relating to horizontal fire breaks within the cladding areas. Can you comment on the RFI attached and whether you believe this interpretation in relation to stack effect is correct? So that's Neil Crawford to Ashton, and then we see Terry Ashton's response at the bottom of page 1.
Yeah.
And his initial response is, Neil, I've never seen details of what you're doing to the external walls. Do you have any cross-sections, elevations? Now, pausing there, what would you have expected Mr. Ashton to do in this situation where he's being sent this request and has realised that he's never seen details of what they're doing to the external walls?
Well, what he's done there, which is ask for the drawings.
Yeah. So that's a reasonable response.
Yeah, that's a reasonable response. But there's a little problem in the background, isn't there? Which is his report said he wanted to do some more work later on B4. And this is, this is a B4, what I would call, Harley and Studio E are interpreting themselves, fire performance, chimney effect, stack effect, to quite complex fire behaviours, by the way. So we are in fire safety territory where advice is needed.
Yeah. Would you have expected him to have pointed out that this was not something that he'd properly addressed in the fire strategy report?
Ideally, yes. I wasn't going to kind of really hammer that point home. Ideally, yes. I think he's asked for the drawings, so that is a reasonable response at this stage.
Okay.
Yeah.
So moving on with the story, further information is then provided by Neil Crawford to Terry Ashton on that same day, on the 18th of September.
Yes.
If we go to EXO 50709, we can see Neil Crawford says to Terry Ashton, hi Terry, please see attached our sections and the initial drawing set we've had from Harley's. The initial drawings from Harley's are fairly limited, but they attempt to establish the basic approach.
Yeah.
And we can see that he sent a number of attachments there.
Yeah.
Including SEA drawing 127906120.
Yeah, it would be good to see that.
Yes, I'll take you to that.
Yeah.
And then detailed sections, number of detailed sections, and Harley's initial drawing set, a PDF of that. Yeah. And then if we go to that drawing 1279, which is at EXO 50710.
Okay. I think if we could look see where it says the number 19 and 20 on the right hand side.
Yeah, so if we zone in on the right.
Yeah, just there, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I don't have a pointer or anything, but I hope I'll try. And so what we see here, I hope you can see the red line of the old window, the new window coming to the left.
Yeah.
And further out to the left, you'll see some dashed lines in a big long strip with the little thing sticking out to the right-hand side. Now that is meant to represent the cavity barriers proposal in the column, as I understand this drawing. And then you see it come in over the top of the window.
Yeah.
I hope, is that okay?
So the more intensively little hatched rectangle.
Yes. And
immediately at the head of the window.
Yes, and it's tricky. Some people are good at reading drawings and are experienced at reading drawings, and some aren't. So it's a tricky drawing to interpret. There is some information written on the left. So it says zinc composite rain screen.
Yeah.
And you actually have to move to the left.
Yeah.
To find the cavity barrier arrow, because it isn't placed on this side of the drawing.
Yeah. Shall we look to the left now?
Just no harm to have a look at it. Okay, and so maybe scroll up a little bit. Or no, actually that's fine. So if you look at P10 435, it has an arrow over to the vertical cavity barrier.
Yeah.
And if you look at P10 435, it has a line to the horizontal cavity barrier. Okay.
Yeah. So the vertical cavity barrier is at the top of that page.
Yeah. And it's just pointing to the dashed lines running down.
Yeah.
And then the horizontal cavity barrier is again pointing into the slightly darkened hashed area near where it says walkway level.
Yeah.
Joining out to the dashed line in the columns. Okay.
Yeah.
So this drawing is very useful.
Yeah. And it also includes somewhere, I think, a reference to thermal insulation H92776.
Let's try and find that. Yes.
I think potentially, if we go up to the
can't
top,
see the whole drawing
of this
anymore.
drawing.
Yeah.
No, I know.
No,
I'm pretty sure it's on here somewhere.
If we could we just zoom out so I can see the whole. Oh God, I can't see anything there.
Maybe go to the bottom left section. There, yes, you can see.
Oh yeah, I can see it
above
now.
the mezzanine level. +9.
Yeah.
3 labels up, you've got H92776 thermal insulation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, would you have expected Mr. Ashton to realise that these numbers labelled on the drawings were to the NBS specification?
Well, I'm going to say no.
No. Okay.
I'm going to say no at the moment. Yeah. So right now, he's being asked about cavity barriers in a particular context, which is Harley's understanding that you get the chimney effect on the columns and you won't get the chimney effect in the windows. Yeah. Okay. And this is the drawing. Yeah. And my memory is Mr. Ashton refers to this drawing in his response. Yes. Yes. It'd be good to see that.
And would you agree that he can see from this what the proposed cavity barrier strategy is?
Their proposed cavity barriers, yes, he can. Yeah. So he can see vertical cavity barriers in the column, horizontal cavity barriers in the column, and between the windows. Yeah. You know, horizontally between the windows. Yeah.
And moving forward with the story, you then note in your report that later that day, Mr. Crawford sends Mr. Ashton the data sheet for Celotex RS5000.
Well, sorry, Can we see his response to this first? Can we go back out to his email?
So I think we were on EXO 50708.
Yeah, thank you. Because his response is very important. So if we
and
scroll
then if we go
up,
to the top of this page.
So what he says is if insulation behind the rain screen cladding is combustible, you will need to provide cavity barriers shown on your drawing. Yeah. And that is wrong.
Can you just explain why why it's wrong?
Because it doesn't matter if the insulation is combustible or not. You are required to provide cavity barriers. Yeah. And I was asked yesterday about being critical. That is why I'm critical. One of the reasons why.
Yeah. So that's just incorrect advice.
That is incorrect advice, inaccurate advice. Yeah.
And would you have also expected him, as part of this response, to highlight that paragraph 12.7 of approved document B requires any insulation to be of limited combustibility.
So at this stage,
Yeah.
no. I think right now, what's needed is for the fire safety engineer to say, you need cavity barriers. They're talking about chimney effects and stack effects.
Yeah.
Okay. He needed to say you need cavity barriers on the floor lines and around the windows and the top of the wall. It doesn't matter what insulation or anything else you've selected for the columns or between the areas between the column.
Yes.
At this point.
I understand. Is there anything else you want to say about this email before we move to the next step?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
So then we note that later that day, Mr. Crawford sends the data sheet for the Celotex. This is SEA 3011724.
Yeah, so is that okay? So Daniel says the insulation is class 0.
Yeah.
So having read your correspondence, because correspondence says if the insulation is combustible, you need cavity barriers.
Yeah.
Daniel says the insulation is class 0. So having read the correspondence, I believe fire barriers are not necessary.
Yeah.
Okay. So he clearly is under the impression that class 0 means non-combustible.
Yeah.
And he's read the advice carefully.
Yeah.
And he's also now checking if his opinion is correct.
Yeah. And then we see the response above.
Yeah. Again, the architect asks the fire safety engineer, are we interpreting all of this correctly?
Yeah. And then his response, Mr. Ashton's response, is then EXO 50714.
Yeah.
And this is what Mr. Ashton says here. So he's... Sorry, you go.
Yeah, just there's the email where the BBA cert is attached. Sorry, excuse me. The Celotex information is attached, and that's when... in Harley's response.
Yes.
They attach the information they're relying on to understand the insulation has class 0 fire performance. And they ask for clarification that their interpretation is correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can we just see where it is attached?
Yes.
Go back to SEA 3011724.
Yeah, so
it's that one. It's where he just
it's
says...
the data sheet, isn't it?
It's in there.
Is this interpretation correct? And we can see the attachment is the rain screen cladding product data sheet, August 14.
So it'd be good to open that.
Yes, let's open that now. That's RYD 3018155.
Yeah.
That's the data sheet that's attached.
Yeah, and if you can zoom in... the front page, just zoom in at the top half. Yeah. So there you go. So Harley, again, they have this information.
Yeah.
They've read it. They think they have an insulation that has class 0. They think it's not combustible.
Yeah.
And they think, therefore, they don't need cavity barriers.
Yeah.
And they're very clear about that.
Yeah. So this then comes to Mr. Ashton.
Yes.
So can I now go to Mr. Ashton's response again? So EXO 50714. And he says this, a material which has a class 0 rating is not necessarily non-combustible, although the reverse is invariably true. Some class 0 products will burn when exposed to a fully developed fire. In any case, you need to prevent fire spread from one flat to the flat above, as I stated in my earlier email. What isn't clear from the information to hand is whether or not there's a continuous cavity from top to bottom in any part of the cladding, apart from around the column casings, irrespective of the type of insulation. In regard to Terry.
Yeah.
Now, you say in your report, first point, that Mr. Ashton is correct that not all class 0 materials are non-combustible.
Yeah. But that's not the important point about this email.
So So the next point you make is that Mr. Ashton doesn't identify the need for the insulation to be of limited combustibility, nor does he correct the erroneous performance cited by Harley.
Yeah, so this is a really important moment in my mind. You've got professionals asking really specific questions about B4, as they're entitled to do. They needed to hear that insulation for a very long time needs to be a material of limited combustibility, which is not class naught. And they needed to hear, regardless, cavity barriers were required around the window, and Harley had shown them on the compartment lines, you know, where the walls and floors meet the cladding.
Yeah.
They hadn't shown them around the window. They needed it to be explained to them that they are required anyway, and that the insulation could not be class naught.
Yeah. So that's what you would have expected a reasonably competent fire engineer to have written in response to the request.
Yes, because it's very simply exactly what it says in the approved document B.
Yeah. So to be clear, this email does not provide clear guidance on what is or is not compliant with the statutory guidance document, nor the functional requirement.
No.
B4. Now, Mr. Ashton refers back to the need to prevent fire spread from one flat to the flat above.
Yes.
Was that correct advice to be giving, just that part?
Yeah, that's correct. But I think there was a need to mention the words cavity barrier, because the design team were asking about cavity barriers. So he was correct to say that.
Yeah.
But it needs some interpretation, doesn't it? And people are already asking for more specific advice.
Yeah. And I think what happens is there's no evidence then that Mr. Anketil-Jones ever confirms the extent of external wall cavity. So nobody gets back to Mr. Ashton about this. Would you have expected him to reasonably follow up on that?
Would I have expected? I would have preferred if he had given accurate advice in the first place. I haven't. I suppose, you know, ideally, maybe he should have been worried. I think he needed to get a reply back to this email more than that's more in the balance of who needed to do what. I think a reply to his email was needed, and more interrogation was needed.
Yeah.
Not to just leave it as occurred on both sides, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you say in your report that the 18th of September 2014 was a point in time when a detailed fire strategy could have been successfully put together.
Yeah, so
you say that just for the transcript, that's page 340, paragraph 14.1.62. Can you just explain why you say that?
Well, it's for the same reason, you know, we've exchanged on in the last day or so. Exova now say that report wasn't final and they were going to do a B4 report or analysis later. These are really detailed B4 questions. The design team clearly needs some help. So it's time to do the work to give them the guidance that they need.
Yeah. Would you have expected Mr. Ashton to have updated that outline fire safety strategy after this correspondence?
It's what I said earlier. It's now time to say, I need to do my B4 work. Are you happy for me to proceed?
Yeah. So you wouldn't necessarily expect him just to go ahead, but what you would have reasonably expected him to do, just to be clear, is to clarify with his client that they are content for him now to finish the work that's incomplete.
Yeah, because it's a safer commercial way to behave.
And might he have needed access to perhaps more information in order to do that full B4 analysis?
Might he have needed more information? Well, he knew the insulation was not compliant.
Yeah.
He should have known there were missing cavity barriers. There's 2 red flags raised. I think it's now time to start worrying about what the external surface is and how together the 3 things can comply with B4.
Yeah.
So it's time to start asking for more information.
Yeah.
But remember, regardless, because in fairness, and I wrote this, it still says zinc on these drawings, erroneously.
Yeah.
But the bigger problem in terms of compliance at that time is the insulation and the cavity barriers.
Yeah.
So I don't know what work he had planned to do to resolve that matter.
Yeah. And we're now in September 2014.
Yeah.
Now, going back to the conversations we were having yesterday about an evolution that was occurring in terms of people's awareness of external flame spread issues, people's awareness of the problem with the use of combustible materials.
Yeah.
Does the fact that this is now September 2014 affect what you were saying yesterday about what a reasonably competent fire engineer should know?
Yeah. So by then, things were, let's say, noisier than they were in 2013, okay, about insulation particularly. The BCA note was issued.
That was June 2014.
Yes, and that group of people had decided on different ways of resolving external wall problems. I don't want it taken that I agree with their proposition, but that was their proposition, and that guidance note was circulating in industry. I struggle to understand, because Exova Warrington Fire were cited in that note as being a company that one could go to for these so-called desktop assessments. I don't know if we're allowed to. Can we see that?
The BCA Technical Guidance Note 18.
I don't know. I mean,
we'll
can just
of course you can see it, and we'll find the reference.
I don't need to, but
No, we'll find the reference.
I think you've got that guidance has been issued. It's circulating widely. I just wish I knew all the dates. I think has the lacrosse fire happened by now? I can't remember. And certainly there's anyway, so there's more noise in the industry and more use of materials going on in the industry at this time.
So I think the lacrosse fire is November 2014,
yeah, I think it is.
But I'm just going to check my notes on that in a minute.
Yeah.
We can go to the BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, CEP 30579294.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we can just scroll down to when it gets to options, please.
Yes. I think that's page 2 of this guidance.
Yeah, option 3, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there it says, if no actual fire test data exists for a particular system, the client may instead submit a desktop study report from a suitable independent UCAS accredited testing body.
Yeah.
And then you've got the BRE, Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire, that's Exova Warrington Fire, stating whether, in their opinion, the BR 135 criteria. So what you're saying is, according to this guidance note, there's only 3 independent UCAS accredited bodies that can do desktop assessment.
At that point.
And this is the guidance, isn't it, that introduces the idea of a desktop report to the industry.
Yes, and you might say it's a tacit acknowledgement regarding the insulation, the use of insulation that is not of a material of limited combustibility.
Yeah. So you would have expected a reasonably competent fire engineer to have been aware of this guidance?
Yes.
And I think what you're saying is, particularly if you're in Exova, to have been aware of it.
Yes.
Just going back to those emails that were exchanged between Mr. Ashton and the team, do you think that it also ought to have been incumbent on him to have asked what the basis of which compliance was being achieved, i.e. were they going to follow ADB in paragraphs 12.6 to 12.9, or were they following the alternative route canvassed in section 12.5. Do you think he should have clarified that of the design team?
I think it should have been in his report anyway. Sorry to be annoying, okay? But at that point, the insulation's not compliant, the cavity barriers are not compliant. It's absolutely time to ask, how is this external wall being assessed?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
How you might phrase that,
Yeah.
I don't know, but it is time to now check and ask.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Chairman, I now want to turn to the March 2015 emails.
Yes.
We could break now.
Would that suit you?
It would suit me just fine.
Well,
we could break now and then do those I'd rather do that in one run than have to start it and then break.
Yes, all right. Well, we're going to take a break now.
Okay.
I think a bit earlier than usual, but it's a convenient point. So
Yes.
we'll come back at 11:30, and please no talking while you're
I
out of
won't,
the room.
no. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are we going along, Miss Grange?
We're doing well. We're doing well. Yes.
All right, 11:30 then, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Right, ready to carry on?
Yep.
Good, thank you. Yes, Miss Grange?
Yes, thank you. Just in terms of dates,
Yes.
it's right that the lacrosse fire was November
It was later, yeah.
2014. And just for the chronology, because I know we're coming to March 2015 next,
Yeah.
the Marina torch fire
Yes.
in Dubai was in February 2015.
Yes.
Yeah. So now I want to turn to the emails that were exchanged in March 2015
Yes.
between Mr. Crawford and Studio E. If we turn to SEA 30130049. So I want to look at the final email on the first page for the moment, going over into the second page.
Yeah.
So Neil Crawford, 31st of March 2015, says, "Hi Terry," and then if we go to the next page, "Can you comment on the history of this item? Please see correspondence below, as it's not clear to me why this item is causing such a difference in interpretation. Can't see anything that seems to reference it in the fire strategy." And he's forwarded correspondence below, which was this debate that was going on between building control and other members of the design team about whether a cavity barrier was required or a 120-minute fire stop in the rain screen.
Yeah.
And then if we go over to that's Mr. Crawford asking for Terry Ashton's comment on this item. If we go then over to the bottom of page 1, Mr. Ashton responds the same day, "Neil, this isn't something that would necessarily form part of a fire safety strategy for a building. Therefore, it would not have been dealt with in the fire safety strategy for this building. I agree with Ben Kay. I believe that a cavity barrier is all that is required in this application. Even if we were to agree with RBKC, it's difficult to see how a fire stop would stay in place in the event of a fire where external flaming occurred, as this would cause the zinc cladding to fail."
Yeah.
So that's his response. Now, you say in your written report that Mr. Ashton is substantially wrong to say that cavity barriers isn't something that would necessarily form part of a fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us exactly why you say that?
Well, I think this correspondence shows exactly the problem with the fire safety engineer not making clear minimum requirements as you know, this concept of reasonably competent fire safety engineering. And the important point is another year has passed and the design team are still confused. And now they've drawn in the RBKC as well.
Yeah.
Everyone's trying to resolve a confusion.
Yeah.
And again, another year later, it needs a competent person with experience of fire safety engineering legislation and fire safety engineering, behaviour of materials and construction forms to give that team some advice.
Yeah. So just to be clear, what you're saying, I think, is that the B3 and B4 sections together of a detailed fire strategy should have answered these questions that they were asking.
Yes, because we now see entering into the narrative here a confusion about the difference between a fire stop and a cavity barrier, and the need for someone who understands that fully, which is the fire safety engineer's job, to explain what those two things are, what they're for, and where they needed to go or not on the Grenfell Tower project.
Yeah. And again, is your answer the same in terms of what you would have expected Mr. Ashton to have done about the fire safety strategy at this point? I think earlier you said,
yes,
at the very least, he should be writing saying it's not complete, it needs to be completed. Do you want me to do this?
Yes, as an absolute minimum.
Yeah. And you think some fire safety engineers may have decided, actually, I'm going to write the strategy now on the back of this?
Honestly, at this point, with the confusion, the most important thing now in the email is to give accurate advice to the design team.
Yes.
Okay? having a detailed fire safety strategy on the record is second.
Yeah.
Okay? Because Exova are now in a position where the design team are confused. They haven't set out what's needed in their report, and they need to deal with that matter arising in the email correspondence.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, we can see that Mr. Ashton is saying later in that it's difficult to see how a fire stop would stay in place in the event of a fire where external flaming occurred, as this would cause the zinc cladding to fail. So he's stating that the zinc cladding can fail. However, is it right that it's your view that he wrongly offers no alternative solution to demonstrate that the external wall construction still meets the functional requirement of regulation B34?
Yes.
In terms of internal fire spread?
Yes.
Now, given that the zinc cladding had been changed to aluminium cladding by this time,
yes.
Do you find it surprising that Mr. Ashton is referring to zinc cladding in this exchange?
Do I find it surprising?
Perhaps a better way of putting this is, ought he to have taken note of the email from Neil Crawford to John Hoban further down the chain, which refers to the new external rain screen aluminium cassettes?
Yes.
So would you have expected him to have read the full chain and picked up, I'll show you where it is in a moment, and picked up the fact they're referring now to aluminium?
Yes, because he was asked, I think if we can scroll down to Neil Crawford's original query of Terry.
Yeah, so that's at the bottom of page 1.
Can
Can you comment on the history of this item?
Yeah, so comment on the history of the item means you need to open up the email and read the history of the item.
Yeah. Please see correspondence below. And then I think if we look on page 4, that's where I think we see an email from Neil Crawford to John Hoban.
Yeah.
In the middle of that page, dated the 27th of March 2015.
Yeah.
Where he says there's been a lot of conversation on site about the cavity barrier requirements. And then in the second line, he's saying between the existing concrete external wall panels and the new external rain screen aluminium cassettes.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, are you saying that a reasonably competent fire engineer reading this correspondence ought to have picked up that what they're now referring to, contrary to what was shown on the drawings that you'd seen in September 14, was aluminium cassettes?
Yeah. Yes, but I don't want to overstate that change, okay? The primary issue here is a lack of understanding about the difference between a fire stop and a cavity barrier. A fire stop is inside the building. A cavity barrier is, out in the external wall.
Yeah.
And the ongoing confusion about which one is required and its performance rating. There's still the problem of the insulation being Celotex. I don't want to say that I don't want to say that I would immediately have expected Terry Ashton to have noticed aluminium and to do something else on that particular day.
Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to be fair.
Yes.
And only focus on the problem in hand, which is incorrect reference to fire stopping, incorrect reference to where cavity barriers go, and a non-compliant insulation.
Yeah. Going back to Mr. Ashton's response, if we can look at that again on page 1. He's talking about how he expects the cladding will perform, and he says in the last couple of lines, it's difficult to see how a fire stop would stay in place in the event of a fire where external flaming occurred, as this would cause the zinc cladding to fail. Yeah. Now, would you expect a reasonably competent fire engineer to bring their understanding of that, i.e. the potential for the zinc cladding to fail where external flaming occurred, to the attention of the building control officer?
Oh. I think I'm going to say no. It would be better if they did. I can imagine that would not happen because you're really now dealing with a design team problem. The building control officer is actually on this chain as well.
Yes, he's further
Do you
down.
know what I mean? I know he's further down, but
yeah. So
I don't want to. I think it would be unreasonable if I said that he should have, kind of called the building control officer.
I understand. And then we can see, just to complete the story, at the top of the page, Neil Crawford responds back to Terry Ashton. Thanks, this was my point as well. Metal cladding always burns and falls off, hence fire stopping is usually just to the back of the cladding line. Thanks for this confirmation anyway. And just to be clear, in terms of the substance of the advice that was being given, I think you agree that it was a cavity barrier required in that location.
Yes.
Not a fire stop.
Correct.
And that's if you look at diagram 33.
Yes.
What do you say to the point, though, that diagram 33, it was the point made by Miss Menzies, I think, when she gave evidence, that diagram 33 is perhaps more suggestive of a traditional masonry construction?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah. And therefore, when you come to a rain screen arrangement, you perhaps don't apply it literally because you're thinking it's slightly different about how a rain screen might behave in fire.
So I don't know about not applying it, but certainly, remember we looked at a drawing earlier, there's lots of lines, dotted lines, hashed lines. It's much more complex than the diagram in the approved document B. So I would say it's going to require more thought.
Yes.
And for me, I would absolutely be calling it an architect at that point, because I would need to understand how, with the complexity of Grenfell Tower, you could end up with something that achieved the same simplicity as set out in approved document B. Do you know what I mean? So I couldn't ignore it, but I'd understand it might look slightly different.
Yes, I do. Yes, I understand.
And rain screen cladding was very prevalent by then, so preferably a new diagram would have been put into approved document B. That would be my preference.
Yeah. Just on that point again, on cavity barriers, at phase 1, when you gave evidence, you expressed some reservations about the effectiveness of cavity barriers in a rain screen system once the rain screen is on fire.
Yes.
You remember we looked at the diagrams of the rain screen warping, etc. But can I be just clear with you, what is your evidence about the importance of cavity barriers around windows in a rain screen system? Is it your view that cavity barriers can be effective and are effective around windows?
Sorry, are you asking me this in the context of Exova's evidence?
No, I'm
generally.
I think Exova have suggested in their opening that a number of experts at phase 1, including yourself, made the point that cavity barriers were effectively redundant in any event. Because of the way the fire spread.
Because of the terrible material used for the external surface.
Yes.
That's the problem.
Yes.
Not some theoretical proposition about cavity barriers around the windows.
Exactly. That's the point I'm just wanting to tease out.
Oh, yeah. So all of this, it's a bit hard to talk about, I do have to say, because it's quite upsetting. But all of this is about the external surface and the insulation and the cavity barriers. It's just theoretical, and I just find it slightly deflecting to start to really hone in on one thing or the other. Yeah. The three together are required to provide the performance.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't want to even get into if the cavity barriers had been there, could something else have happened? The cavity barriers were not there, the insulation was not compliant, and the external surface was highly combustible. And there's nothing else to say in my mind.
I understand. And just one more question.
Yeah.
You're clear, are you, that cavity barriers can be effective round windows, even in a rain screen system?
No, I've never said that, and I'm not going to say that now.
I see.
Okay? But I don't want that to be taken as a reasonable excuse never to have considered them in the first place.
I understand.
Okay? I don't want to imply that.
Yeah. Now, just some questions now about building control and what happened with building control later in the project. Now, you're aware, I think, that it was Studio E that had a lead role on building control approval and the building control approval process.
Yes, on behalf of Ryden, as I understand it.
Would it be normal for a fire consultant, a fire engineer, to liaise directly with a building control officer, or would they normally do that through the design team?
Yeah,
in your experience?
So normally you work in partnership, with the design team as you go through the approvals process. If you get worried about something, or if you have something very complex and you feel the need to do, maybe have a special meeting, do something else, I suppose is it just professional courtesy that, you would work with the company and let them know that's what you wanted to do.
Yeah.
And typically together then you would approach building control, or the architect or the contractor may say, you keep going on your own. So again, it's about asking, and agreeing the plan.
Yeah. Now, we know early in the project that Exova did have some direct contact with building control. For example, Exova sent issue 1 of their outline fire safety strategy directly to building control.
Yeah.
Just for the transcript, the reference is SEA 406443, where Mr. Ashton did that. Would that be normal practice on a project like this for a fire engineer to send their fire strategy or their outline fire safety strategy direct to building control?
Do you mean not telling anyone before they did it, or just that it was I don't recognise that as being a negative thing.
No, fine.
Once you're keeping everyone else in the loop. Yeah.
I just want to then look at some more September 2014 emails, some more correspondence between Neil Crawford, Terry Ashton and John Hoban. If we look at EXO 50454, this is an email from Neil Crawford to Terry Ashton, attaching revised fire strategy drawings, and then saying, Terry, please find attached revised fire strategy plans for Grenfell Tower regeneration project. Now, at this point, I think it might be helpful to distinguish between a number of things. Is it right that fire strategy drawings, as they're referred to, say, in this email, are different from the fire safety strategy that Exova had been writing?
The report, yes.
Yeah.
So a report is a narrative. The drawings are meant to show the location of the fire safety measures.
Yeah. And then there are a number of drawings attached. These, just to be clear, they show the first 4 floors of the tower and a typical residential floor in those drawings. And then Mr. Ashton replies 10 days later, if we go to EXO 401441, on the 29th of September, he says this, at the top of that page, Neil, apologies for the late response. I came back on Monday after a week away. He's been catching up. I think this opening is a relic from the past and can be blocked up. Sorry, I should have read from the top of page 2. Apologies. If we go to the top of page 2, he says, 29th of September, sorry for the lateness. Then he says this, the proposed changes highlighted in your email are acceptable from a fire strategy point of view. And then he gives a little bit more detail. Now, pausing there, would you have expected, just assume this was all that was going on in September and assume the 18th of September exchanges about the external wall haven't happened, would these kind of exchanges, in your view, should they have prompted Mr. Ashton to think about going back and revising the fire strategy report that he'd done?
Yes.
So yes, your view is that should have
because
happened.
Things change throughout construction.
Yeah. So again, is your answer the same, that at a minimum you would expect a reasonably competent fire engineer to clarify whether or not he ought to do that, given he can see that changes are occurring?
Yeah. And so then you might agree with your client, let's wait a few months and sweep up all the changes in one final issue of your report on X date. So I'm not implying there's just this constant reissuing of the fire strategy. Typically, you give your advice and you agree a final sweep up and a final version.
Yes. And if we look at what you say, I think, about these exchanges in your report, page 255, paragraphs 8.2.10. And you say this, however, even though substantial changes had been made to the proposed layout of the building, the review of a new set of design drawings in September 2014 did not lead Mr. Ashton to communicating to Studio E, Ryden or TMO that their fire strategy report needed to be updated to match the layouts he had just commented on.
Yeah.
Instead, Mr. Ashton simply stated in his email that the proposed changes are acceptable from a fire strategy point of view.
Yeah.
Now, just to follow forward with what happened next on this string, if we go to RBK 402974, so this is a message then from Neil Crawford to John Hoban, the building control officer, on the 18th of November 2014, and he's attaching a number of plans, etc. And if we look in the email, can we just pan out, because I need to just find the... I think in this email somewhere he attaches the X-over Rev B changes. I can't see that in that email. Sorry, that might be a wrong reference. But there's an email, perhaps I can just read out to you what happens. There's an email that then occurs where Neil Crawford forwards Mr. Ashton's reply to building control and says, please see attached the current X-over study, which was written prior to the fire strategy Rev B changes, and also attach the correspondence with X-over relating to the Rev B changes. There it is, sorry.
Yeah.
Which we will modify accordingly. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
So, sorry, this is back on the 29th of September 2014. Neil Crawford sent those exchanges to John Hoban.
Okay, and so Neil is referring to the drawing Rev B.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's to ask you a little bit about that final few words he uses. So he says, which we will modify accordingly. Now, does it look like from these exchanges that Studio E are acknowledging that the fire strategy is out of date and offering themselves to modify the fire safety strategy?
No.
Can you explain what's happening
I
instead?
see the architect offering to update their drawings.
I see. And that would be normal practice, would it?
You have to update the drawings till the last day.
Yeah. So that doesn't suggest, in your view, is this right, that somehow Studio E themselves are taking on responsibility for updating the fire strategy themselves?
Absolutely not. It does show an understanding, though, doesn't it, that there's a difference in completeness or, a reflection of where the design, the detailed design actually is at this stage during construction.
Yes.
Okay, so things are out of sync.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The key point I wanted to put to you is whether this is somehow Studio E assuming responsibility for the fire strategy.
No, I think that's an unfair allegation, actually. That's not what that email says to me.
Yeah, and just one further email on this topic, and then I'll move to a different topic. A little later, if we go to EXO 401441 on page 1 and look at the foot of page 1, Mr. Crawford's response back to Mr. Ashton is, "Hi Terry, we will take this forward for building control discussion regarding the Rev B modifications."
Yeah.
So again, same question.
Yeah.
Do you see that as somehow Studio E assuming responsibility for the fire strategy?
No, again, they're talking about their drawings. I mean, what I would wonder is why neither Mr. Crawford nor Mr. Ashton in this exchange One of them doesn't say, when are we updating the fire strategy to reflect the changes?
Yes.
Just as we are updating the drawings to reflect the changes, because both were required. And again, perfectly normal professional practice to do both.
Yes, I understand. And then I think you may have heard Miss Menzies give evidence that in her opinion, later than this, Mr. Paul Hanson, she felt wrongly took it upon himself effectively to redesign the fire strategy in terms of the smoke control system. So in her report, Miss Menzies is critical of how much input Mr. Hanson put into the design of that system, which she felt overstepped a boundary. Again, similar question. Do you see that as somehow building control themselves taking on responsibility for the fire strategy?
No, I don't. But building control always have to be very careful about any advice they give, because once they step over that line, they enter into CDM territory and take on design responsibility. And it's a very delicate line they have to walk based on my own experience of working with building control officers.
Yeah.
I don't particularly want to criticise Paul Hanson for doing that. I've some sympathy with what he was trying to achieve.
Yeah.
But yes, it is dangerous for building control officers and approved inspectors when they start to stray into giving advice or making changes. And we would raise concerns when that happens on our projects, which it does.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, my penultimate main topic, CDM, just briefly, as it applies to Exover's work. I know Ms. Grogan's going to be asking you about your CDM report.
Yeah.
Now, in chapter 14 of the first version of your report dealing with the fire engineer's work, you expressed the view that Exover was a designer for the purposes of the CDM regulations because fire safety strategy is an important performance specification in the design process.
Yes.
Yes. Now, does that remain your view?
Yes.
And I think you suggest that there were three types of information that, pursuant to Regulation 18.2 of the CDM Regs 2007, Exover should have provided to the CDM coordinator, principal designer, for inclusion in the health and safety file.
Yes.
That was in the first version of your report. And what I want to ask you is that chapter doesn't feature in the next version of your report. Well, so we don't get the same comment later, but we want to be clear whether that's still your view that they are designers.
I need to see where I wrote that in the first version. I don't have it with me.
So
I'm afraid to answer that question.
I'll bring it up. This is BLARP 2, 603, page 249. And that's paragraph 14.1.6 and following, where you say, first, I consider Exover to be a designer because, and then you've got the definition of a designer under the 2007 regs.
Yeah.
And then you say, with design defined as includes drawings, etc. And then you say Regulation 2 of CDM states, and you set out the definitions there of design and designer. Yeah. And then below that, 14.1.10, you say, I consider the fire safety strategy to be a substantially important performance specification in the design process. Yeah. And so a fire safety engineer is a designer.
Yeah. Yeah. That remains my view. I now need to be, I have my own version of report comparisons. Yeah. And I need to go back and check. You're saying it's gone. Because
that's not a criticism. It was
no, I know that, but I want to make, I want to do a comparison, and if it is gone, I need to put it back in.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Now, the Exover witnesses were asked about their understanding of the CDM regulations and whether they would have been classified as designers. Now, let's just look briefly at what Mr. Ashton said. This is day 16, page 120, lines 1 to 24. So I ask him the question at the top of that page, can you also explain why there's no mention of the CDM regulations anywhere in this fee proposal? And he says, at line 4, we have traditionally taken the view that we're not designers as defined under the CDM regulations. That's changing, I think, in the light of the fact that we sometimes design smoke extract systems, and so possibly we need to look at that. Undoubtedly, if we were still employed at this stage of the RIBA stages of works, then we would be in touch with the CDM regulations. So with design approved to ensure that the CDM regulations are met. So maybe that's something else that we would need to put into our documentation. And then I say, can you expand on why it is that Exover's taken the view that they're not designers? For example, if they're preparing a fire strategy for a building. And he says, well, because when we prepare a fire strategy for a building, in most cases we're referring to published documentation. A designer would do something unique or original. So as I say, if we're given the task of designing a smoke extract system for a shopping centre, then we could be deemed to be designers. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And I just want to ask whether you agree with that.
No.
No. And you maintain your view as expressed in the sections of the report that I just took you to.
I don't think the CDM regulation says that a designer does something unique or unusual.
And in your view, would a reasonably competent engineer or engineering firm have appreciated that they were designers under the CDM regs at the time they were working on the Grenfell project?
Yes.
Okay, now my final substantive topic is about disabled and mobility impaired persons. And if we look at... actually, this is one of those A3 parts of your report, so
okay.
I put up that warning. But if we go to page 129 of your report, table 5.7 at the top.
Yeah, can I just be clear that in module 3 I'm doing extensive work about all the different types of people that need assistance in the event of a fire. I've not finished that work, and I don't want to give any final opinions on this subject until I have finished that work.
I understand.
Okay, because it's not something I focused on very heavily in this module 1.
I understand. I mean, the key point I'm going to want to put to you is that when Exover's witnesses were taken to a number of passages in approved document B, which deal with mobility impaired persons and other similar topics, the answers that they gave were, well, approved document B doesn't require us to do anything concrete. It doesn't make any positive suggestions that we have to do anything different as a result of those initial paragraphs. So that's why we don't see it in their existing or refurbishment fire strategies.
Okay.
It's that point I want to ask you about.
Okay, understood. Yeah.
So just going back to table 5.7 in your report, you say that paragraph, I want to deal with paragraph 3.3.1 of the existing strategy. Sorry, can I just have a look on the left-hand side? Because I need to orientate myself. Yes, so if we then go to section 9, across the page again. And somewhere in here, you make the comment that it doesn't provide any information on disabled persons or any other occupant requiring assistance to escape. The end of the second paragraph in that box, yes. So
yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, have you got that clearly?
Yeah, I can see it on the paper version.
Yeah. So in that section, Ms. Cooney's dealing with evacuation strategies based on defined principles, etc., using terms from BS quadruple 9, X over proceed to set out why a simultaneous evacuation is most appropriate for levels 1, 2 and 4. And then you say, however, this does not provide any information on disabled persons or any other occupant requiring assistance to escape. Yes. And if you look on page 180 in table 6.11, box 8. So this is instead where we're dealing with now the outline fire strategy for the refurbishment project, the first version of that. You state there that it provides an overview of means of escape arrangements for the nursery, etc. And then in the penultimate paragraph there, you say, Exova do not state design requirements for travel distance, minimum escape width, route widths, calculations of number of occupants, minimum door sizes, or provision of refuge spaces for disabled people. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So what we can see is that in a number of places, both as regards the existing fire strategy and the refurbishment fire strategy, you are critical of Exova in terms of what information has been provided about the occupants requiring assistance to escape, their vulnerabilities. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, in her evidence, if I take you to Dr. Barker's evidence first, if we go to day 15 of the transcript, page 143, lines 4 to 11, so, actually, let's go to the bottom of day 14, of page 142, the page above, so I can see exactly the question. So this is Mr. Millett asking Ms. Cooney, Dr. Barker, and he says, at the very bottom there, line 22, let me see if I can put the question a bit less delicately and a bit more bluntly. Did it occur to you when you saw Ms. Cooney's report to think to yourself, given that we're dealing with residents in a high-rise block and we've got to advise the TMO on the fire safety management plan for the occupants, we should look at how we're going to get people with mobility issues out? And she says, no, I didn't consider that. And Mr. Miller asks, can you help us understand why that is? And then the answer is, because again, if they did have mobility issues, then maybe Grenfell Tower wasn't the best place for them to live. To reiterate, approved document B does not make any provisions in residential buildings for people with mobility impairments. Now, pausing there, and before I ask you about this, I also want to show you what Mr. Ashton said on this same topic. And if we go to day 17 now, at page 149, and we're discussing a similar topic here. And if we pick it up at 14, I say, do you agree that there's no requirement specified anywhere here in this report for the responsible person regarding mobility impaired persons? So I'm putting to him that there's nothing specified anywhere in his report for the responsible person regarding mobility impaired persons. And he says this, well, that's a difficult one. I'm not saying it's a difficult question for me. There are no requirements to put in place provisions for facilities for disabled persons in residential buildings. They are excluded from the requirements for other buildings, simply, I think, on the basis that you can't manage it in this type of building, and that persons with disabilities, if they're not in the fire-affected apartment, are perfectly safe to stay where they are. Do you see that there?
Yep.
And then if we go on to the next page, and I say, does that mean that in the preparation of these reports you didn't consider the means of escape for those with disabilities? No, but the law didn't require us to. And then I say, at this time, were you aware that approved document B requires consideration of means of escape for those with a disability? And he says, I think that was a general statement in the approved document, but it didn't apply specifically to apartment blocks because there are no provisions for apartment blocks in the guidance. And then we go to that, and I take him to that. and I take him to a number of references within that. And he says he's aware of the general cross-reference at line 22. And if we go over the next page, I'm taking him to a number of parts of approved document B. And at his answer at line 11, he says, I absolutely agree with that sentiment, but I go back to the point I made. There are no recommendations in the documentation issued by government departments or others as to what you do about means of escape for disabled persons in residential buildings. And then at line 17, he said, you might say, well, there should be, but the fact is there are not. Okay. So that was Dr. Barker and Mr. Ashton's evidence. And I want to ask you about whether they're right, that there is no requirement within approved document B to make provision for those with mobility issues or other disabilities.
That's a very long question. So remember, Grenfell Tower has two uses. One is residential, one is non-residential. And so it would be helpful to go to approved document B if we can, because I
was going to take you to it next.
Yeah.
So if we go CLG 50173, and I was going to pick it up on page 12 at paragraph 0.13. There are a number of passages within ADB.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to. Could we go to inclusive design 019 first, please?
Yes, that is on page 14 of this document. So there, at the bottom there of the left-hand column.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want me to?
So it says there, the fire safety aspects of the building regulations are made for securing reasonable standards of health and safety of persons in and about buildings. This is intended to include all people, including people with disabilities.
Yeah.
Part M of the regulations, access to and use of buildings, requires reasonable provision for access by people to buildings. Regardless of compliance with building regulations, there will also be obligations under the Disability Discrimination Act for service providers and employers to consider barriers created by physical features in buildings. People, regardless of disability, age or gender, should be able to gain access to buildings and use their facilities, both as visitors and people who live and work in them. And then it says this, as such, the fire safety measures incorporated into a building will need to take account of the needs of all those persons who may have access to the building. It is not appropriate, except in exceptional circumstances, to presume that certain groups of people will be excluded from a building because of its use.
And then the sentence up on the top.
And then it says the provisions set out in this approved document are considered to be a reasonable standard for most buildings. However, there may be some people whose specific needs are not addressed. In some situations, additional measures may be needed to accommodate these needs. This should be done on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Now, with reference to that, and I know there are other passages in the approved document which have a similar sentiment.
Yes.
In your view, do you consider that a reasonably competent fire safety engineer should take those general paragraphs into account when preparing a fire safety strategy?
I think we're required to do so.
Would you have expected Exova to have given guidance in both fire safety strategies, i.e. in the existing one and in the refurbishment one, on persons who may have required assistance to evacuate?
Yeah, so remember, Grenfell Tower, we need to split it into two when we're thinking about this subject, okay? So for the lower floors, which are non-residential, there is guidance in approved document B very specifically about provisions for those uses.
Yeah.
Okay.
Including things like refuges,
etc.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's all set out.
Yeah.
So the lower floors, there was clear guidance available. The upper floors, which I think you might want me to focus on,
yes,
is a different matter. Okay. And I don't know if we. So it is correct that when it comes to refuges, that is in the part of approved document B that excludes high-rise residential buildings.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is correct. When you get to the general, after, I think it's section 5 in a B1, I don't know if we can go there. in approved document B? Can we?
So we might
just don't want to
We'll just
ad-lib.
quickly find the page number for that.
Is that okay?
So
because
section 5 in B1.
In B1 of approved document B, which is for all buildings again.
Yeah.
Okay. So sorry, excuse me, all uses, excuse me.
Yes.
Yes, all uses. It draws in there this issue of mobility impairment. So I just want to wait. I don't want to ad-lib the text in the ADB.
Actually, maybe have a look at page 18. Is it under criteria for means of escape, B1,
Yeah, let me
5?
see. Oh, yeah.
Is that what you're
let me
referring
just.
So there's a note at the bottom of underneath A and B in that heading, criteria for means of escape on the right-hand side.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So looking at B1.5.
Yeah.
Some people, for example, those who use wheelchairs, may not be able to use stairways without assistance. For them, evacuation involving the use of refuges and escape stairs and either assistance down or up stairways or the use of suitable lifts will be necessary.
Yeah.
Okay. So I am very clear in my own mind. There is no section in the approved document B for high-rise residential buildings that expressly asks for, you know, X and Y measure. So it doesn't say in a high-rise residential building, please put in refuges, please put in lifts. Okay, I understand that and I accept that. But it makes very clear that these are reasonable measures, and there are cases where the person doing, you know, the fire safety engineer needs to consider the occupancy profile and if these general provisions are relevant.
Yes.
Okay. So on the lower non-residential floors, Exova did need to set out the published guidance, and on the upper floors, there were a few things that needed to be considered, okay?
Yes.
Because remember, in the risk assessment for Grenfell Tower, it said there were evacuation lifts if people had a PEEP.
Yeah.
Okay? So I'm looking into all of that at the moment.
Yes, I understand.
Okay?
Yeah.
So there is a complexity that requires attention and careful attention, because if there are evacuation lifts, as a fire safety engineer, I need to understand that. Why are they safe to use? Why have they been provided? What is the occupancy profile of this building that merited, apparently, the need for an evacuation lift and for potentially PEEPs?
Yeah.
Okay? And I think that the inclusive design part of approved document B and other signals around lifts, not about refuges at the moment, is enough for a fire safety engineer to just raise the issue.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Probably wouldn't want to go very much further on that point.
No,
but I don't at all agree that there was nothing needed on the lower floors and there's no duty whatsoever to even consider the residential floors.
Yes. And just very specific to Exova's work, would you expect a reasonably competent fire engineer to have requested information from the TMO, from the client, about the occupancy profile of those in the tower?
If I read in a fire risk assessment for a building, a high-rise residential building, that they had an evacuation lift, I would absolutely want to know why, and so I needed to ask about the occupancy profile.
Yeah. And would that be limited to disability issues, or would any other characteristics of residents be in mind?
I would prefer to talk about all the different characteristics in Module 3, because I'm in the middle of I'm just doing a lot of work on that at the moment.
It's really getting across the point about whether further information should have been requested. It's your evidence that it should have been, yes?
Yes, because I said the risk assessment says there is an evacuation lift, so you need to know why.
Yeah. And would you have expected these issues about those requiring assistance to evacuate to have been addressed expressly in both the existing fire strategy and the refurbishment fire strategy?
As a minimum for the non-residential floors.
Yeah. And just help us, we talked a lot yesterday about the site visit. If a proper site visit had been done and someone had looked at the lift as part of that site visit, how obvious would it have been on that site visit that the lift was not a fully functioning firefighter lift in the way that term is understood?
Oh, a firefighter lift, not an evacuation lift. Are we in a different subject? Sorry.
No. I'm really trying to discover from you how obvious it would have been to Exover if they'd gone to site, what the limitations were of the lift there that they had.
Okay, so that would be difficult to observe on a quick walk around. If it was an evacuation lift, British Standard 9999, for example, says the lift needs to be signed as such, okay? It would be very difficult, based on my experience as a fire safety engineer, to stand outside a lift and work through, the level of detail, for example, I've done in my phase 1 report. You need drawings. I'd need to talk to, other engineers.
Yeah. So you don't think there might have been key signs in terms of physical signs about the lift that might have told you that it was or wasn't a certain standard of lift?
Well, if I'd been told it was an evacuation lift,
yes,
before I went to site,
yes,
I'd want to see the sign in the building that says it's an evacuation lift.
Yeah.
You're meant to have a notice that it's there as a minimum.
Yeah.
When Miss Grange refers to signs, I think what she really had in mind was physical indications.
I think that would be very difficult. Now, others may say they should immediately notice, but I would find that a very difficult thing to do myself.
I see. Yeah, I was thinking about
just
features.
on a quick tour. You couldn't do it. Yeah.
Sorry, I think we're both talking over one.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Sorry.
I was thinking of exactly physical indicators, such as the hatch for firefighters inside the lift, or other similar features.
Yeah. If you're doing a 2-hour walk around,
I understand that about 2 hours, but I think your evidence yesterday was a reasonable time period for that visit would have been a day.
At least, okay. So sorry, do you mean sometimes I get confused because that didn't happen and you asked me to talk about things that never happened.
I know.
Okay.
I'm saying if a reasonably competent fire engineer had done a proper site visit and had taken the time that was necessary on that site visit, would they have been able to discover that it wasn't an evacuation lift?
So if a fire safety engineer was going to check all the active safety measures, now you need to bring a checklist with you to site for visible features of the lift shaft, doors, the buttons, the interiors, to try and work out if it is the evacuation lift / firefighting lift as it was categorised in the fire risk assessment.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't really speculate on, that Exover didn't do that, so I can't speculate on what they might have done in something that they didn't do. I'm sorry, I just don't have that kind of
Just tell me this, if you go to visit a building of this kind, let's say even just for a couple of hours, I imagine you spend a bit of time in the lifts, don't you? Don't walk up and down all the stairs.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
So, I mean, you are actually in the lift and you get a chance to see...
Yes.
But anyway, you don't think that's enough to tip you off to whether it's one sort or another? It may not be, I don't know.
You'd hope so.
I don't think you're very confident, are you?
Oh, I just... if you're in the lift, I would hope that you would notice.
Okay.
Well, what would you notice if you noticed it at all?
Do you mean if I was standing in the lift?
Yes, if you were just you were in the lift.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you might take the opportunity to chat to anyone who's with you doing the survey. So
I may not look up. I mean, you know what I mean? I may not look up. Now, if you sent me to site and said, Barbara, you're not to come back here without telling me if this is a firefighting lift or not, I'll have my checklist with me. So I don't want to...
No. All right.
over
I think we probably
stretch.
pursued that as far as we can. Thank you.
just finally on this topic, I just want to ask you if British Standard 9991 2011 might also be relevant to the question as to whether or not the evacuation of disabled occupants or occupants that require assistance to escape ought to have been considered.
Yeah.
Can I pull that up? This is
Yeah.
LFB 3024106.
Yeah.
This is that British Standard Fire Safety in the Design, Management and Use of Residential Buildings Code of Practice. And if we go within that to page 128, at 52 there,
Yeah.
evacuation of disabled occupants or occupants that require assistance to escape, it says there, providing an accessible means of escape should be an integral part of the fire safety management in all residential buildings. Fire safety management should take into account the full range of people who might use the premises, paying particular attention to the needs of disabled people.
Yeah.
It's important to note that it's the responsibility of the premises management to assess the needs of all people to make a safe evacuation when forming evacuation plans. Was that guidance also potentially relevant to whether this topic ought to have been expressly addressed in the two different fire safety strategies?
Yeah, because they're the recommendations. I think that's the 2011. They're the recommendations published at the time.
Yeah.
And they don't say there's nothing to do in high-rise residential buildings.
Yeah.
This is the high-rise. This is the residential British Standard.
Yeah. So, just now to finish off a couple of very short topics. Gold standard. What would you say to the suggestion that your approach represents a gold standard, which is not realistic as a benchmark for fire engineers more generally?
I would say, how rude. And then I would ask, what is gold standard? Okay, because the only benchmark I've used in this work are all the published guidance documents and absolutely nothing else. If I was to draw in anything else, I think my report would be classified as even more critical than it's been. So I have expressly and deliberately only relied on published guidance documents and referred to them every single time. And if there are people out there who think that's a gold standard, well, shame on them, is all I've got to say.
Okay. Now, your overall conclusions about Exover's work, they are set out at section 14 of your report. I just want to pull those up. If we go to page 335, they're at 335 to 341. This is a summary, so you've very helpfully at the end distilled down your conclusions about Exover's work here. And we can see you deal with Exover's scope and fee. And then if we look at page 338 and following, you've got there at 14.1.39 the conclusions about Exover's fire safety strategy reports for the primary refurbishment. And there's your conclusions there.
Yeah.
And then at page 340, you've got your conclusions about Exover's advice relating to cladding, and you set out there your core conclusions, including your conclusions about the 18th of September exchanges, which we dealt with this morning.
Yeah.
And overall, your conclusion on page 341 of that, at paragraph 14.1.80, you say, overall, I conclude that the advice provided by the fire safety engineers was entirely inadequate.
Yeah.
Now, do those conclusions, do they still remain your opinion, having heard all the oral evidence that
Yes,
you have?
they do.
Mr. Chairman, those are all of my questions. It probably makes sense to have perhaps a 10-minute break just to sweep up any final questions about Exover's work.
Okay.
And then it might be sensible then perhaps to take an early lunch.
Well, let's see how we're going, shall we? But I think you're right. I think it would be sensible now to have a short break to sweep up any additional questions. So if I say 10 minutes or longer if you find it necessary, but otherwise we'll come back at 20 to 1.
Okay.
And see whether there's anything else.
No problem. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, 20 to 1 then, please. But if you need longer,
We'll say.
just
Thank you.
tell us. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Right, well, we'll see if there are any more questions. Now, Ms. Grange, where are we?
So we've got no further questions, but literally about 30 seconds ago, an email's pinged into my inbox from somebody at Team 2 for the residents asking whether they could have another 10 minutes to draft a question.
10 minutes to draft it? All right.
Maybe what we should do is, because I'm keen to give Miss Grogan as much time as possible this afternoon, and we could break for lunch now, and I can consider the question over the lunch break.
Yeah.
And if it needs to be put, I can quickly put it at 1:45, and then let Miss Grogan carry on.
Yes. Well, that sounds sensible, and then whoever's drafting the question won't necessarily feel under too much pressure.
No.
All right. I think that what we'll do, we'll stop now and have some lunch.
Okay.
We'll start a bit earlier than we usually do after lunch. We'll start again at 1:45.
Okay, that's fine.
Usual injunction, please don't speak to anybody about your evidence.
Yeah, okay. Thank
And
you.
then we'll see if there is a question that needs to be put to you, and we'll sweep it up then.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much. Right,
Thank
1:45 then, please.
Thank you.